Today, I'm going to read from The Other America, Poverty in the United States by Michael Harrington. The book was written in 1962 and supposedly is the book that sparked the war on poverty. You can tell how old the book is because it's only 95 cents when I bought it. Unfortunately, the war on poverty has not been won. It was not won in the 50s, and it has not been won up till the present time. And many things that I will be reading apply as much to today as they did to the 1950s. Chapter 1, The Invisible Land. There is a familiar America. It is celebrated in speeches and advertised on television and in the magazines. It has the highest mass standard of living the world has ever known. In the 1950s, this America worried about itself, yet even its anxieties were products of abundance. The title of a brilliant book was widely misinterpreted, and the familiar America began to call itself the affluent society. There was introspection about Madison Avenue and tail fins. There was discussion of the emotional suffering taking place in the suburbs. In all this, there was an implicit assumption that the basic grinding economic problems had been solved in the United States. In this theory, the nation's problems were no longer a matter of basic human needs of food, shelter, and clothing. Now they were seen as qualitative, a question of learning to live decently amid luxury. While this discussion was carried on, there existed another America. In it dwelt somewhere between 40 million and 50 million citizens of this land. They were poor, they still are, and the statistical basis for the information that is in this text is in an appendix. To be sure, the other America is not impoverished in the same sense as those poor nations where millions cling to hunger as a defense against starvation. This country has escaped such extremes. That does not change the fact that tens of millions of Americans are, at this very moment, maimed in body and spirit, existing at levels beneath those necessary for human decency. If these people are not starving, they are hungry, and sometimes fat with hunger, for that is what cheap foods do. They are without adequate housing and education and medical care. The government has documented what this means to the bodies of the poor, and the figures will be cited throughout this book. But even more basic, this poverty twists and deforms the spirit. The American poor are pessimistic and defeated, and they are victimized by mental suffering to a degree unknown in suburbia. This book is a description of the world in which these people live. It is about the other America. Here are the unskilled workers, the migrant farm workers, the aged, the minorities, and all the others who live in the economic underworld of American life. In all this, there will be statistics, and that offers the opportunity for disagreement among honest and sincere people. I would ask the reader to respond critically to every assertion, but not to allow statistic quibbling to obscure the huge, enormous, and intolerable fact of poverty in America. For when all is said and done, that fact is unmistakable. Whatever its exact dimensions, and the truly human reaction can only be outrage. As W.H. Auden wrote, hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. The millions who are poor in the United States tend to become increasingly invisible. Here is a great mass of people, yet it takes an effort of the intellect and will even to see them. I discovered this personally in a curious way. After I wrote my first article on poverty in America, I had all the statistics down on paper. I had proved to my satisfaction that there were around 50 million poor in this country. Yet I realized I did not believe my own figures. The poor existed in the government reports. They were percentages and numbers in long, closed columns, but they were not part of my existence. I could prove that the other America existed, but I had never been there. My response was not accidental. It was typical of what is happening to an entire society, and it reflects profound social changes in this nation. The other America, the America of poverty, is hidden today in a way that it never was before. Its millions are socially invisible to the rest of us. No wonder that so many misinterpreted Galbraith's title and assumed that the affluent society meant that everyone had a decent standard of living. The misinterpretation was true as far as the actual day-to-day lives of 2/3 of the nation were concerned. Thus, one must begin a description of the other America by understanding why we do not see it. There are perennial reasons that make the other America an invisible land. Poverty is often off the beaten track. It always has been. The ordinary tourist never left the main highway, and today she rides interstate turnpikes. She does not go into the valleys of Pennsylvania, where the towns look like movie sets of Wales in the 30s. She does not see the company houses in rows, the rutted roads. The poor always have bad roads, whether they live in the city, in towns, or on farms, and everything is black and dirty. And even if she were to pass through such a place by accident, the tourist would not meet the unemployed men in the bar or the women coming home from a runaway sweatshop. Then, too, beauty and myths are perennial masks of poverty. The traveler comes to the Appalachians in the lovely season. She sees the hills, the streams, the foliage, and not the poor. Or perhaps she looks at a rundown mountain house and remembers Rousseau rather than seeing with eyes, decides that those people are truly fortunate to be living in the way they are, and that they are lucky to be exempt from the strains and tensions of the middle class. The only problem is that those people, the quaint inhabitants of those hills, are undereducated, underprivileged, lack medical care, and are in the process of being forced from the land into a life in the cities where they are misfits. These are normal and obvious causes of the invisibility of the poor. They operated a generation ago. They will be functioning a generation hence. It is more important to understand that the very development of American society is creating a new kind of blindness about poverty. The poor are increasingly slipping out of the very experience and consciousness of the nation. If the middle class never did like ugliness and poverty, it was at least aware of them. Across the tracks was not a very long way to go. There were forays into the slums at Christmas time. There were charitable organizations that brought contact with the poor. Occasionally, almost everyone passed through the black ghetto or the blocks of tenements, if only to get downtown to work or to entertainment. Now the American city has been transformed. The poor still inhabit the miserable housing in the central area, but they are increasingly isolated from contact with or sight of anybody else. Middle-class women coming in from suburbia on a rare trip may catch the merest glimpse of the other America on the way to an evening at the theater, but their children are segregated in suburban schools. The business or professional man may drive along the fringes of slums in a car or bus, but it is not an important experience to him. The failures, the unskilled, the disabled, the aged, and the minorities are right there across the tracks, where they have always been, but hardly anyone else is. In short, the very development of the American city has removed poverty from the living emotional experience of millions upon millions of middle-class Americans. Living out in the suburbs, it is easy to assume that ours is indeed an affluent society. This new segregation of poverty is compounded by a well-meaning ignorance. A good many concerned and sympathetic Americans are aware that there is much discussion of urban renewal. Suddenly, driving through the city, they notice that a familiar slum has been torn down and that there are towering modern buildings where once there had been tenements or hovels. There is a warm feeling of satisfaction, of pride in the way things are working out. The poor, it is obvious, are being taken care of. The irony in this, as the chapter on housing will document, is that the truth is nearly the exact opposite to the impression. The total impact of the various housing programs in post-war America has been to squeeze more and more people into existing slums. More often than not, the modern apartment in a towering building rents at $40 a room or more. For during the past decade and a half, there has been more subsidization of middle and upper income housing than there has been of housing for the poor. Clothes also make the poor invisible. America has the best dressed poverty the world has ever known. For a variety of reasons, the benefits of mass production have been spread much more evenly in this area than in many others. It is much easier in the United States to be decently dressed than it is to be decently housed, fed, or doctored. Even people with terribly depressed incomes can look prosperous. This is an extremely important factor in defining our emotional and existential ignorance of poverty. In Detroit, the existence of social classes became much more difficult to discern the day the companies put lockers in the plants. From that moment on, no one saw men in work clothes on the way to the factory, but citizens in slacks and white shirts. This process has been magnified with the poor throughout the country. There are tens of thousands of Americans in the big cities who are wearing shoes, perhaps even a stylish cut suit or dress, and yet are hungry. It is not a matter of planning, though it almost seems as if the affluent society had given out costumes to the poor so that they would not offend the rest of society with the sight of rags. Then many of the poor are the wrong age to be seen. A good number of them, over 8 million, are 65 years of age or better. An even larger number are under 18. The aged members of the other America are often sick and they cannot move. Another group of them live out their lives in loneliness and frustration. They sit in rented rooms, or else they stay close to a house in a neighborhood that has completely changed from the old days. Indeed, one of the worst aspects of poverty among the aged is that these people are out of sight and out of mind and alone. The young are somewhat more visible, yet they too stay close to their neighborhoods. Sometimes they advertise their poverty through a lurid tabloid story about a gang killing, but generally they do not disturb the quiet streets of the middle class. And finally, the poor are politically invisible. It is one of the cruelest ironies of social life in advanced countries that the dispossessed at the bottom of society are unable to speak for themselves. The people of the other America do not, by far and large, belong to unions, to fraternal organizations, or to political parties. They are without lobbies of their own. They put forth no legislative program. As a group, they are atomized. They have no face, they have no voice. Thus, there is not even a cynical political motive for caring about the poor as in the old days, because the slums are no longer centers of powerful political organizations. The politicians need not really care about their inhabitants. The slums are no longer visible to the middle class. So much of the idealistic urge to fight for those who need help is gone. Only the social agencies have a really direct involvement with the other America, and they are without any great political power. To the extent that the poor have a spokesperson in American life, that role is played by the labor movement. The unions have their own particular idealism, an ideology of concern. More than that, they realize that the existence of a reservoir of cheap, unorganized labor is a menace to wages and working conditions throughout the entire economy. Thus, many union legislative proposals to extend the coverage of minimum wage and Social Security to organize migrant farm laborers articulate the needs of the poor. That the poor are invisible is one of the most important things about them. They are not simply neglected and forgotten, as in the old rhetoric of reform. What is much worse, they are not seen. And one might take a remark from George Eliot's Felix Holt as a basic statement of what this book is about. This is a quotation. There is no private life which has not been determined by a wider public life, from the time when the primeval milkmaid had to wander with the wanderings of her clan because the cow she milked was one of a herd which had made the pasture bare. Even in the conservatory existence, where the fair camellia is sighed for by the noble young pineapple, neither of them needing to care about the frost or rain outside, there is neither apparatus of hot water pipes liable to cool down on a strike of the gardeners or a scarcity of coal. And the lives we are about to look back upon do not belong to those conservatory species. They are rooted in the common earth, having to endure all the ordinary chances of past and present weather. 40 to 50 million people are becoming increasingly invisible. That is a shocking fact. But there is a second basic irony of poverty that is equally important. If one is to make the mistake of being poor, born poor, she should choose a time when the majority of the poor are miserable too. J.K. Galbraith develops this idea in The Affluent Society, and in doing so defines the newness of the kind of poverty in contemporary America. The old poverty, Galbraith notes, was general. It was the condition of life of an entire society, or at least of that huge majority who were without special skills or the luck of birth. When the entire economy advanced, a good many of these people gained higher standards of living. Unlike the poor today, the majority poor of a generation ago were an immediate, if cynical, concern of political leaders. The old slums of the immigrants had the votes. They provided the basis for labor organizations. Their very numbers could be a powerful force in political conflict. At the same time, the new technology required higher skills, more education, and stimulated an upward movement for millions. Perhaps the most dramatic case of the power of the majority poor took place in the 1930s. The Congress of Industrial Organizations literally organized millions in a matter of years. A labor movement that had been declining and confined to a thin stratum of the highly skilled suddenly embraced masses of men and women in basic industry. At the same time, this acted as a pressure upon the government, and the New Deal codified some of the social gains in laws, like the Wagner Out. The result was not a basic transformation of the American system, but it did transform the lives of an entire section of the population. In the 30s, one of the reasons for these advances was that misery was general. There was no need then to write books about unemployment and poverty. That was the decisive social experience of the entire society, and the apple sellers even invaded Wall Street. There was political sympathy from middle-class reformers. There was an elan and spirit that grew out of a deep crisis. Some of those who advanced in the 30s did so because they had unique and individual personal talents. But for the great mass, it was a question of being at the right point in the economy, at the right time in history, and utilizing that position for a common struggle. Some of those who failed did so because they did not have the will to take advantage of new opportunities. But for the most part, the poor who were left behind had been at the wrong place in the economy at the wrong moment in history. These were the people in the unorganizable jobs in the South and in the minority groups and in the fly-by-night factories that were low on capital and high on labor. When some of them did break into the economic mainstream, when, for instance, the CIO opened up the way for some blacks to find good industrial jobs, they proved to be as resourceful as anyone else. As a group, the other Americans who stayed behind were not originally composed primarily of individual failures. Rather, they were victims of an impersonal process that selected some for progress and discriminated against others. Out of the 30s came the welfare state. Its creation had been stimulated by mass impoverishment and misery, yet it helped the poor least of all. Laws like unemployment compensation, the Wagner Act, the various farm programs, all these were designed for the middle third in the cities, for the organized workers, and for the upper third in the country, for the big mass market farmers. If a man works in an extremely low-paying job, he may not even be covered by Social Security or other welfare programs. If she receives unemployment compensation, the payment is scaled down according to her own low earnings. One of the major laws that was designed to cover everyone, rich and poor, was Social Security. But even here, the other Americans suffered discrimination. Over the years, Social Security payments have not even provided a subsistence level of life. The middle third have been able to supplement the federal pension through private plans negotiated by unions, through joining medical insurance schemes like Blue Cross, and so on. The poor have not been able to do so. They lead a bitter life and then have to pay for that fact in old age. Indeed, the paradox that the welfare state benefits those least who need help most is but a single instance of a persistent irony in the other America. Even when the money finally trickles down, even when a school is built in a poor neighborhood, for instance, the poor are still deprived. Their entire environment, their life, their values, do not prepare them to take advantage of the new opportunity. The parents are anxious for the children to go to work. The pupils are pent up, waiting for the moment when their education has complied with the law. Today's poor, in short, miss the political and social gains of the 30s. They are, as Galbraith rightly points out, the first minority poor in history, the first poor not to be seen, the first poor whom the politicians could leave alone. The first step toward the new poverty was taken when millions of people proved immune to progress. When that happened, the failure was not individual and personal, but a social product. But once the historic accident takes place, it begins to become a personal fate. The new poor of the other America saw the rest of society move ahead. They went on living in depressed areas and often they tended to become depressed human beings. In some of the West Virginia towns, for instance, an entire community will become shabby and defeated. The young and the adventurous go to the city, leaving behind those who cannot move and those who lack the will to do so. The entire area becomes permeated with failure, and that is one more reason the big corporations shy away. Indeed, one of the most important things about the new poverty is that it cannot be defined in simple statistical terms. Throughout this book, a crucial term is used: aspiration. If a group has internal vitality, a will, if it has aspiration, it may live in dilapidated housing, it may eat an inadequate diet, and it may suffer poverty, but it is not impoverished. So it was in those ethnic slums of the immigrants that played such a dramatic role in the unfolding of the American dream. The people found themselves in slums, but they were not slum dwellers. But the new poverty is constructed so as to destroy aspiration. It is a system designed to be impervious to hope. The other America does not contain the adventurous seeking a new life and land. It is populated by the failures, by those driven from the land and bewildered by the city, by old people suddenly confronted with the torments of loneliness and poverty, and by minorities facing a wall of prejudice. In the past, when poverty was general in the unskilled and semi-skilled workforce, the poor were all mixed together, the bright and the dull, those who were going to escape into the great society and those who were going to stay behind. All of them lived on the same street. When the middle third rose, this community was destroyed, and the entire invisible land of the other America became a ghetto, a modern poor farm for the rejects of society and of the economy. It is a blow to reform and the political hopes of the poor that the middle class no longer understands that poverty exists. But perhaps more important, the poor are losing their links with the great world. If statistics and sociology can measure a feeling as delicate as loneliness, and some of the attempts to do so will be cited later on, the other America is becoming increasingly populated by those who do not belong to anybody or anything. They are no longer participants in an ethnic culture from the old country. They are less and less religious. They do not belong to unions or clubs. They are not seen, and because of that, they themselves cannot see. Their horizon has become more and more restricted. They see one another, and that means they see little reason to hope. Galbraith was one of the first writers to begin to describe the newness of contemporary poverty, and that is to his credit. Yet, because even he underestimates the problem, it is important to put this definition into perspective. For Galbraith, there are two main components of the new poverty: case poverty and insular poverty. Case poverty is the plight of those who suffer from some physical or mental disability that is personal and individual and excludes them from the general advance. Insular poverty exists in areas like the Appalachians or the West Virginia coalfields, where an entire section of the country becomes economically obsolete. Physical and mental disabilities are, to be sure, an important part of poverty in America. The poor are sick in body and in spirit. But this is not an isolated fact about them, an individual case, a stroke of bad luck. Disease, alcoholism, low IQs, these express a whole way of life. They are in the main the effects of an environment, not the biographies of unlucky individuals. Because of this, the new poverty is something that cannot be dealt with by first aid. If there is to be a lasting assault on the shame of the other America. It must seek to root out of this society an entire environment and not just the relief of individuals. But perhaps the idea of insular poverty is even more dangerous. To speak of islands of the poor, or in that more popular term, pockets of poverty, is to imply that one is confronted by a serious but relatively minor problem. This is hardly a description of a misery that extends to 40 or 50 million people in the United States. They have remained impoverished in spite of increasing productivity and the creation of a welfare state. That fact alone should suggest the dimensions of a serious and basic situation. And yet, even given these disagreements with Galbraith, his achievement is considerable. He was one of the first to understand that there are enough poor people in the United States to constitute a subculture of misery, but not enough of them to challenge the conscience and the imagination of the nation. Finally, one might summarize the newness of contemporary poverty by saying, these are the people who are immune to progress. But then the facts are even more cruel. The other Americans are the victims of the very inventions and machines that have provided a higher living standard for the rest of society. They are upside down in the economy, and for them, greater productivity often means worse jobs, and agricultural advance becomes hunger. In the optimistic theory, technology is an undisguised blessing. A general increase in productivity, the argument goes, generates a higher standard of living for the whole people. And indeed, this has been true for the middle and upper thirds of American society, the people who made such striking gains in the last 2 decades. It tends to overstate the automatic character of the process, to omit the role of human struggle. The CIO was organized by people in conflict, not by economic trends. But it states a certain truth for those who are lucky enough to participate in it. But the poor, if they were given to theory, might argue the exact opposite. They might say progress is misery. And I will stop here. I'll continue till the end of the section. Okay? As the society became more technological, more skilled, those who learn to work the machines, who get the expanding education, move up. Those who miss out at the very start find themselves at a new disadvantage. A generation ago in American life, the majority of working people did not have high school educations. But at that time, industry was organized on a lower level of skill and competence, and there was a sort of continuum in the shop. The youth who left school at 16 could begin as a laborer and gradually pick up skills as he went along. Today, the situation is quite different. The good jobs require much more academic preparation, much more skill from the very outset. Those who lack a high school education tend to be condemned to the economic underworld, to low-paying service industries, to backward factories, to sweeping and janitorial duties. If the fathers and mothers of the contemporary poor were penalized a generation ago for their lack of schooling, their children will suffer all the more. The very rise in productivity that created more money and better working conditions for the rest of the society can be a menace to the poor. But then this technological revolution might have an even more disastrous consequence. It could increase the ranks of the poor as well as intensify the disabilities of poverty. At this point, it is too early to make any final judgment, yet there are obvious danger signals. There are millions of Americans who live just the other side of poverty. When a recession comes, they are pushed onto the relief rolls. Welfare payments in New York respond almost immediately to any economic decline. If automation continues to inflict more and more penalties on the unskilled and the semi-skilled, it could have the impact of permanently increasing the population of the other America. Even more explosive is the possibility that people who participated in the gains of the 30s and 40s will be pulled back down into poverty. Today, the mass production industries where unionization made such a difference are contracting. Jobs are being destroyed. In the process, workers who had achieved a certain level of wages, who had won working conditions in the shop, are suddenly confronted with impoverishment. This is particularly true for anyone over 40 years of age and for members of minority groups. Once their job is abolished, their chances of getting similar work are very slim. It is too early to say whether this phenomenon is temporary or it represents a massive retrogression that will swell the numbers of the poor. To a large extent, the answer to this question will be determined by the political response of the United States in the 60s. If serious and massive action is not undertaken, it may be necessary for statisticians to add some old-fashioned pre-welfare state poverty to the misery of the other America. Poverty in the 1960s is invisible and it is new, and both these factors make it more tenacious. It is more isolated and politically powerless than ever before. It is laced with ironies, not the least of which is that many of the poor view progress upside down as a menace and a threat to their lives. And if the nation does not measure up to the challenge of automation, poverty in the 1960s might be on the increase.